Hello there. So as we look at retirement planning or long-term decisions in general, we usually look for advice from different people. And on your team of advisors, there's an MVP, a BFF. Do you know who that is? Well, I'm going to tell you. Well, hi there, my wandering and pondering friends. Bill here. So as I said, when we make long-term decisions like retirement planning, we want feedback, we want advice, we want input from a bunch of different people. And we create a little team, but on that team there's somebody that's very important, an MVP or a BFF, so to speak. Now, is that your financial advisor? Is that your lawyer, your tax accountant, your spouse, somebody else, somebody that's retired already? Glenn Dougal? No. It's none of them, it's actually you, or more specifically, future you. So I got interested and first heard about future self concepts back when, shortly after I retired, I had read a book by Dr. Benjamin Hardy called Be Your Future Self Now. I think I mentioned it on an early podcast, and in that he talks about the concept of shifting from looking at your past to define yourself to setting goals for the future and making decisions based on what allows you to arrive at those goals, to sort of redefine yourself. My interest increased recently when I heard a podcast where Hal Hershfield was the guest speaker. And Hal Hershfield is a professor of marketing, behavioral decision making, and psychology at UCLA's Anderson School of Management. And he's done a lot of research in this field of future self. And some of the research really jumped down at me. They did this work to look at, through MRIs and scans of different types, how the brain responds to these discussions of future self versus current self versus other people. And what they found is that the parts of the brain that light up, that are used when you're talking about your future self, are the same parts that light up and are used when you're talking about other people. And those are different than when you're talking about yourself in the current present tense. And that was pretty interesting. And now, he said it does vary, right? Like a lot of things we would expect it to vary. But that they could correlate those that had better connections to their future selves tended to do better in saving for the future or in healthy lifestyle choices. And so I found that pretty interesting. He also just came out with a book called Future Self, Making Tomorrow Better Today. And this book is chock full of research and stories. In fact, one of the stories reminded me, he talked about one of the Jerry Seinfeld skits, one where Jerry talks about two guys. There's night guy and morning guy, which are really the same person. But night guy is the one that stays up late and doesn't let morning guy get any sleep. And so morning guy has to pay the price for it. And so kind of that concept of future self, or what decisions are we making now that are going to affect our future self down the road. Now you might be saying, why do I have to think about future self? Because future self is really just me, a little older. Right? Well, let me ask you this. So if you look back 5, 10, 15 years in the past, how much did you change in that time frame? And then I'd also ask you to think about 5, 10, 15 years in the future, and how much do you think you're going to change then? How's your self going to change? Now, that also kind of begs the question is, what the heck do we mean by self? How do we define self to begin with? I mean, on one hand, the way cells die out and get replaced with new cells, my body has completely been replaced already. And so am I really the same person from that standpoint? Some real existential questions that come into play with this. And so different research has been involved in this, a lot of bunny trails we can go down. Some talk about self is really defined by your moral compass. That's what defines really you. There are others, and in the book briefly mentions this, that there'll be different categories in terms of your personalities and your tastes. How open are you to new experiences? How outgoing are you? Levels of kindness, selfishness, all those different factors. Now, there's also people out there, there's an 18th century philosopher that was adamant there's no such thing as self. So stop trying to define it because it doesn't exist. Now, that would make this video kind of dull, so we're going to assume that there is something that makes up self. That it's about our tastes, our moral compass, our personalities, and how some of those things do change over life, right? Because like, I remember there was a time if you had asked me about eating raw fish, I would have laughed at you. But now, unless it comes from a gas station, I'm into sushi. I'll like it. So we do change over time. I asked you the question earlier about changing in the past and changing in the future. There's some other research that was done that measured that and basically said, on average, decade to decade, there's the same amount of change in our lives. We just don't recognize it. We are able to better see changes in us in the past than we are in seeing changes that may occur in the future, or think about that. Now, part of that's maybe the sense of we want to say that we've already arrived, right? If I'm going to say that I'm going to change in the future, we would hope that would be a change for good, not bad, but that also implies that there's something wrong with us now that we want to change or improve, and we don't always want to admit that or acknowledge that. And so that's a factor in here. In fact, there's some researchers such as Dan Gilbert who talk about something called the end of history illusion. And that's this idea that we have trouble picturing things changing in the future. That we're kind of tied to that idea of we've arrived, and we are pretty much what we're going to be for the rest of our lives. And that's not entirely true, right? Because as I said, the research shows on average we're going to keep changing in different ways, right? And not just physically. Now, we also have to factor in a few other things, right? One is this concept of delayed gratification. Right? So it wasn't in the book, but probably a lot of us have heard about the experiment with marshmallows and kids, right? Where you give a child or tell a child they can have one marshmallow now, or they can have multiple marshmallows later on. A surprisingly number of children choose the one marshmallow now, right? They don't want to wait for extra. And that's the way we are at times, right? Also kind of tied to that is we have better identifying with our current emotions. Our emotions often help drive our decisions and actions in the current sense. But we have a much more difficult time thinking about our emotions in the future. And that's why if we know we have to do something difficult, we'll sometimes put that off because we can identify with the negative feelings of it now more than the negative feelings in the future. And so we're struggling with that as we try to connect with our future self. We've established that we want to be better connected to our future self, but then you may ask, how do we go about doing that? And the book talks a lot about that. Four of the methods that I'll share that I got out of it are these. So the first one is kind of fun. You take a picture of yourself, and using an app, you have that digitally modified to make you look older. And so there's a lot of apps and websites out there that do this. And so you can take that picture then, put it someplace where you're going to see it a lot, and that's a constant reminder of a future you. For some of us that look a little old to begin with, the change may not be that drastic, but it's still valuable. And in the case of Glenn Dougal, well, not much can be done with him, but we figured out a way to make Glenn look a little bit older as well. Now, the app I used was FaceApp, but there's a lot out there. I would encourage you to double check what kind of data it collects and what it does with that. But that's a fun way in the first method in this. Another method is having a proxy for a future you. Now, some of us have parents that we're similar to, and we can use that. I know there's times when I'll be talking to my siblings, and one of us will say, hey, I just did something Dad would do, or reminded me of something Mom would say or Dad would say. And so as we look at our parents, that can be a good way of having a proxy or a surrogate future you, right? And it doesn't have to be a relative. Sometimes we can just look at other people and do that as well. So it was interesting. I was talking with some friends earlier this week about the fact that my father, towards the end, was living in a retirement home where basically his room was 12 by 20, right? And just the fact that all of his belongings fit in that room. Well, fit in that room, plus he would use the trunk of his car as kind of an extra closet. So we would find stuff there as well. But I started looking around at all the stuff I have, and how is that going to fit in one room like that? Or at what point will that be the case? And so I think by looking at the changes our parents went through or other relatives, that can give us a sense of the future us, right? And the realization that that will be a sense of us. Now, I know we don't all have ideal parents, and so maybe that doesn't work for everybody, but it's still something to consider. Another way to connect with our future self is correspondence. And so the idea of writing letters to your future self, or pretending you're your future self and writing letters back to you. Now, I know I've done this in the past more from the sense of writing to 15-year-old Bill or 20-year-old Bill, and trying to steer me away from some mistakes I'd made, right? That's healthy too, in a sense that it reminds us that we do change over time. And so you can do this simply with writing a physical letter, putting it in an envelope, putting a date on the envelope, when you should open it. What I've started to use is a website called Future Me. And so what this website does is it allows you to form emails and give it a date in the future as to when those emails should be delivered. And so what I'm doing is a 6-month, a 1 year, and a 5-year letter to my future self. And when I get that 6-month letter, I'll write another 6-month letter for that. And just a way to express what I'm feeling now, what I'm thinking they might be thinking. See, I said they, what I mean me in the future, what future me might be thinking and doing at the time. And then the fourth method I've kind of alluded to already is this idea of some group discussion. Now, I've been fortunate that I have friends and family who over the years have talked about the future at times. And so we have some idea of thinking about, when might we retire? What might that look like? Where might we live? Different things along those lines. And that can be healthy. Even, as I said earlier, the discussion with my friends about the space in which my father lived towards the end. We know our future self now. We've realized that there's changes we might want to make in our life. How do we go about doing that? What are some tools or approaches to making the right decisions to make life better for a future self? And so there were 5 that I felt more significant to pull out of the book. And so the first is kind of a sense of accountability partners. And so this can either be one-on-one or as a group where you all agree to kind of keep one another accountable to some decision or group of decisions, whether it be how you're saving, how you're spending time with family, healthy life choices, all those different things. Now, everybody has to be kind of serious in this process for it to work. And pardon me here. And we have to be honest with one another in this process, right, for it to really work well. So another method is a sense of accountability, but it's more public. So you announce to the world that you're going to do something, right? An example of this was not from the book, but a man called Jocko Willink. I may have referenced him in the past. So He does a lot of work in leadership consulting. He's a Navy SEAL or ex-Navy SEAL. He has a podcast. He has a lot of different endeavors. One of the things he does, or is a proponent of, is getting up early. And so kind of started this by accident, but he posts a picture on Twitter each morning of his watch at 04:30. And he's done that long enough that if he didn't, or if he's a little late on it, he hears a little bit about it. So there's a sense of that accountability, or what some people would call pre-commitment. Now, pre-commitment gets bigger, and historically you'll hear about things like, burn the ships or burn the boats, which is the concept of commanders, as they would invade, come on shore on a foreign land, they would burn the boats behind them so that the men had no choice but to go forward into battle. You couldn't get in the boats and retreat because there weren't any boats anymore. The Old Testament talks about this as well. The prophet Elijah goes looking for a new prophet and finds Elisha plowing in the field. Anoints Elisha as the new prophet, and Elisha turns around, slaughters the oxen that are pulling his plow, sacrifices them, and then burns the plow. Kind of to say, if this prophet gig doesn't work, there's no going back to farming because I just lost all my equipment. And so that was a real pre-commitment there. And so those things factor in. That's another way of doing it, but kind of a serious way. Now, I know for myself, when I published my very first video, that was a degree of pre-commitment, because I realize now this is for real. I guess I'm really doing this. So we often talk about reward punishment systems, or carrot and stick. And so the idea of a stick here would be, if you fail in your commitment, to punish that. Now, the book talks about all sorts of different examples here, including one that was kind of extreme from my view, of burning money if you didn't do something. But there's different ways of doing that. Maybe it be you put extra money in your savings account if you don't exercise that week. Different things along those lines. Or you don't get to watch TV. Or something else you enjoy. You don't get to go golfing. Some more extreme vehicles for this is there's a website called Stick, stick.com. And on that you sign up and you give a goal that you are committing to, but then you also give your credit card. And then if you fail in your goal, they don't just take money away from you, they will send it to a charity that you hate. So if you lean one way or another politically, money will go to the other party, or some other charity you don't believe in. If you're an Eagles fan, money goes to Dallas. I don't know, something like that. So that can be pretty extreme, right? Now, you can probably do flavors of this with your accountability partners, right? Some friendly wagers there. So another approach is something that they call make big small. This is the idea of breaking things down so they don't look so insurmountable. They talk in the book about research where they approach a group of people and ask them how willing they would be to put, or how likely they would be to put $1,800 away for savings a year. And then they also asked other people how likely would they be to put $5 a day away. Because $5 a day doesn't seem like much. And so what the research showed was that people asked about $5 were more likely to do it, even though that's slightly more than the $1,800. I guess people don't do the math to figure it out. But that idea of breaking things down, making them smaller, right? Don't think about going for a 30-minute run. Think about running for 5 minutes, and then think about running for an additional 5 and an additional 5 until you're at that 30-minute mark. All sorts of different ways that we can chop things up to do that commitment. And then the last or fifth item is more of a carrot. So it's what they call temptation bundling. The idea that you mix something you really like with something you're not really excited about doing. And so the negative and positive kind of cancel each other off, or hopefully the positive is a little bit better and really makes you want to do that. And so they'll give examples of if you really love a certain show on Netflix, you're allowed to watch that, but you're only allowed to watch it while on the treadmill or Stairmaster. Things of that nature. And so that can be effective in terms of giving us something to look forward to and yet getting through that thing as well. So there you go, 5 different approaches or ways to try to keep your commitment and avoid that procrastination. If you have other methods, I'd love to hear about them. So how do you deal with procrastination or building your willpower, or something I sometimes talk about is won't power, I won't do this. So let me know in the discussion below. I'd love to hear that. Well, it's a hot one here, and if you're wondering where here is, I'm at Wolf Park in the town of Shenango, just a little bit off of Front Street, a mile or so. Great local park. Here it's got a mixture of woods, forests, some shrubs, and some field areas there as well. One area with a great view. You'll also see that behind me here, Dorman Creek runs through here. It creates a little bit of a gorge area. Now, as a result of that, when we get heavy rains, there's really no place for the water to go, and so it's going to flow down through here with a great bit of force. And so as a result of that, the bridge that I'm currently on here has been wiped down a few times. Now this current one here, they rebuilt and it's solid. There's 6x6s that make this up, and probably drive a Sherman tank on it. Now Dorman Creek is going to keep going down here behind me. It's going to flow into Castle Creek eventually and then into the Shenango River. But with that, cutting through the gorge, there's a little waterfall there. And as I said, some overlooks and some other areas there. So a great place. Now, the Triple Cities Hiking Club has also spent some time out here this year doing trail maintenance on the trails. And with that, they've rerouted a couple of the trails. Some went through some really muddy, kind of like steal your boots kind of mud areas. And so they've rerouted that. Still not mud free, but far better. So with that, you do want to check the maps. I'd encourage you to find a map that's July of 2023 or newer. Or in particular, pay attention where the White Trail and the Connector Trail and the Hill Trail meet. That junction is a little bit different than some of the older maps show. So watch that space there. Yeah, if you're interested in Triple Cities Hiking Club, it's a great group. I'll put a link in the description below to check that out. So in an early video here, we talked about balance. In fact, you might recall me walking on a log, balancing. And so that's important here as well, right? We don't want to be so focused on future self that we forget about present self, right? Also, especially considering that future self might be different than we think, or what future self values might be different, right? So we don't want to miss once in a lifetime events that creates memories and friendships that are going to be helpful in retirement or later for future self. In the book, it talks about a couple that had been planning a vacation, I believe kayaking in New Zealand, and they wrestled a lot with, was it worth spending that much money for that trip? But as soon as they were on the trip, they laughed about why did they even question it? Because the memories of that trip were so powerful. And so that's something we have to factor in here, right? In retirement, you're just not going to need money. You're going to want memories and friendships wrapped around those to take you forward. And so that's going to be important. It's okay, I saw a chipmunk do this. In fact, that chipmunk has some nuts down here. Well, I really appreciate you all spending some time with me today. I know that's precious, but I'm now going to encourage you to spend some time with future you. In fact, while you're doing that, have future you check in on future Bill. Actually, what we need to do is do a video, a future me video. In fact, I'm going to record that right after I get done this, and we'll put it out there. We'll have it scheduled to be published a year from now. So I'll record it, edit it, but leave it out there, and we'll let it age for a year and check in then. So hope you're still around then. Till then, have a great day, y'all.